Hello everybody, so welcome to part 3 of toxin sequestration theory. This is my new theory of cancer. I'm very excited about it because it recasts cancer as something that the body does on purpose. So it's very different from the mainstream view, which views cancer as a selfish, malignant, uncontrolled growth. Rather, in this theory, TST, or toxin sequestration theory, cancer tumors are the body's defense mechanism against toxic overload. So whenever the body is overloaded with toxins, it needs help. It needs additional tissue to sequester and store those toxins. So it creates a cancer tumor as additional tissue simply for the purpose of sequestering, storing, and processing toxins. We can also think of a cancer tumor as kind of like a second organ, a second liver. In many cases, liver damage precedes cancer. And if you have damage to your primary detox organ, your liver, then the body says, well, I need help. So I'm going to create a second liver in order to detoxify these toxins and store these toxins. So that's the new theory. Now, I've already talked about this in an interview with Dave Mack, as well as in part 1 and part 2 of my YouTube series. So you can watch those videos. In part 1, I talked about how the mainstream theory of cancer, the genetic theory, has been disproven by the nuclear transfer experiments, so it's wrong. I also talked about Thomas Seyfried's theory, which is a metabolic theory for cancer, which I think is more correct than the mainstream theory, but nevertheless, I still tried to reinterpret his theory from a different perspective. He has these two fuel sources, sugar and glutamine, that appear in his theory as fuel sources for cancer growth. I reinterpret those from the perspective of toxin sequestration. I say, well, sugar is a toxin, glucose and fructose are toxic, and the body's trying to protect, the cancer tumors are trying to protect the body from the toxicity of sugar. And similarly, glutamine, I reinterpreted that as a carrier of a toxin, ammonia, and the body is trying to detoxify ammonia by pulling in glutamine. So I reinterpret that aspect of Seyfried's theory. And I think that provides an elegant view on why cancer likes sugar so much and why cancer likes glutamine so much. Now in part 2, I talked about some other toxins. I talked about seed oils. I talked about excess iron. I talked about microplastics, and I talked about ethanol and cigarette smoke. And then in every case, for each of those toxins, cancer tumors are actively trying to sequester and store and process those toxins in order to protect the body from their harmful effects. In this video, I'm going to extend to a couple more toxins. I'm going to talk about first estrogen and then mycotoxins, which are mold toxins. So first, let's talk about estrogen. Now, when you think of estrogen, of course, you think, well, it plays a physiological role in the body, so it actually has some purpose. But just like we saw for iron also has a purpose too, but when in excess, it can be a toxin. And specifically, estrogen, when it's in excess, it creates reactive oxygen species, or ROS, and those reactive oxygen species then cause tissue damage, right? They cause damage to the body's tissues and organs, and so they create oxidative stress, and anything, by the way, that creates ROS is going to be linked to cancer. So sure enough, estrogen is linked to cancer. You may have heard the phrase, cancer is estrogenic. I heard that phrase before, and I didn't know what it meant. Now I finally understand what it means. And what I'll basically say is that what it means is that cancer is trying to sequester estrogen to protect the body from estrogen's toxic effects. And you could ask, well, what are the main sources of excess estrogen in our daily lives? Number one is obesity. That's obviously a widespread epidemic, and that's because excess fat creates more estrogen. Each fat cell expresses an enzyme called aromatase, and aromatase converts testosterone and other androgens to estrogen. So it converts other hormones to estrogen. And so basically fat cells produce estrogen. So the more fat tissue you have on your body, the more potential excess estrogen you could have. And that's the number one source of estrogen in people's daily lives. The number two source is exogenous hormones. So things like hormone replacement therapy gives people a big dose of estrogen, as well as birth control. So for women who take birth control, they can get a dose of estrogen from that birth control. So that's the number two source of excess estrogen in people's lives. Liver damage as well can be another source because the liver does detoxify estrogen. The liver actually views estrogen as a toxin and it tries to detoxify it. But if you do have liver damage from other sources, like from chronic alcohol consumption, then you could get excess estrogen because then the body can't process it as well. And then another source would be xenoestrogens. So there's things like BPA in plastics that act like estrogen, and that's another potential source. So those are the main sources of excess estrogen. And sure enough, when we look at what cancer cells do, they dramatically upregulate their estrogen receptors on their cell surface, which allows them to bind to estrogen and pull it inside cancer cells. And then once the cancer cells have the estrogen inside, they detoxify it just like the liver does. So they upregulate their enzymes needed to detoxify estrogen, and that allows them to rapidly detoxify it. And there's a very close analogy, once again, between the cancer tissue and the liver. It looks like the cancer tissue is acting like the body's second liver. They both do the same detoxification of estrogen. Okay, so that's fully consistent with our TST theory. We're reinterpreting estrogen as a toxin when in excess, and sure enough, cancer is trying to sequester it and process it just like the liver would. Let's move on to the next toxin, which is mycotoxins. So mycotoxins are mold toxins that funguses produce, and they produce them as part of their chemical warfare against like bacteria and other microbes. So you can view mycotoxins as chemical warfare in the microbial world. Now, basically these microbes compete for food. You have imagine a piece of fruit and the mold's growing on it and the bacteria is growing on it, but the mold want to claim it as their territory. So they can secrete these toxins to fight off the bacteria. But we get caught in the crossfire because these chemicals are also toxic to us as well. They're not just toxic to bacteria. And so we get caught in this warfare between microbes. The number one of the most important sources of mycotoxins is plant-based foods. Things like corn and grains and fruits, nuts. So you probably heard of aflatoxins, which actually grow on peanuts, and that's a mycotoxin. But anyway, these are all plant-based foods. The reason why plant-based foods have these toxins is because the preferred food of funguses and molds is plant-based foods. That's what they like. They like to eat plant carbohydrates. And so they grow on plants. The good news for carnivores is that we're not exposed to these mycotoxins much because they're not really found in the animal-based foods. They're largely in the plant-based foods. Yet another, pro-carnivore thing, right? So the number two source of mycotoxins would be from water-damaged buildings. So you may have heard that if you have water damage in your home or in like an apartment complex building, then you can get mold growth. And that mold growth will release these mycotoxins into the air, and then you can inhale the mycotoxins. And that can lead especially to a chronic inflammatory condition called CIRS, C-I-R-S. So those are the two main sources, like I said, plant-based foods as well as water-damaged buildings. Now, sure enough, the cancer tumors want to protect us from these mold toxins. So what they do is that they, there's no specific receptor, by the way, on the cancer cells for these mold toxins. And in fact, these toxins come in different shapes and varieties and sizes. And so the best way that the cancer cells can use to pull them in is something called bulk endocytosis, where they just drink the body fluids. So they just suck up body fluids. And like I said, they do this more prominently than normal cells do. I talked about this for microplastics previously. Cancer cells pull in microplastics through this bulk endocytosis, and similarly, that's the same way that they pull in the mycotoxins. So yeah, cancer cells dramatically upregulate this bulk endocytosis. They're drinking the body fluids in order to pull in the mycotoxins, and then they can't really do much with them once inside. They just largely store these mycotoxins inside them. Yeah, so that's how cancer cells protect us from these mycotoxins. Interestingly, I'm not the only person that has connected funguses to cancer. There's another guy, his name is Mark Lintern, and he has a whole theory of cancer related to funguses. He believes that cancer tumors represent a fungal infection of normal cells, where basically a fungus invades the normal cell, and then that normal cell becomes a zombie or like a protective shell for the fungus in order to protect it. He supports this idea with the fact that physical pieces of funguses have been found inside of cancer tumors, like fungal DNA. Now, that's an interesting theory, but I'm going to reinterpret it from my perspective. So, from my perspective, cancer tumors want to protect the body from toxins. Funguses produce toxins, and cancer tumors drink the extracellular fluids. So as they're drinking these extracellular fluids with endocytosis, they could not only pull in the toxins themselves, but also pull in the funguses too. They could be pulling parts of funguses, as well as swallowing up whole pieces of whole funguses, right? And so it's biologically plausible that cancer cells actually like suck up funguses into their cellular interior through this bulk endocytosis as part of their efforts to try to sequester toxins. So that's my interpretation. It's the sort of exact opposite from Lintern's interpretation, because he's thinking that the funguses are invading the cancer cells. I'm saying that the cancer cells are swallowing up the funguses to protect the body from toxins. Yeah, so that's a different, sort of perspective. Not to mention that some funguses like Candida also produce ethanol, which is yet another toxin. So that's another toxin that cancer tumors would like to protect us from. So I think that provides a nice reinterpretation of fungus's role in cancer that's different from Lintern's theory. And I think it's important to note that certainly funguses are not the only important thing with cancer. I mean, like the fungal theory of cancer that Lintern has can't explain things like, well, why does cigarette smoke cause cancer, right? Why do microplastics cause cancer? Why do heavy metals cause cancer? So I think that we want to take a bird's eye view and make sure we cover everything. And these fungal toxins are just one particular type of toxins that cancer tries to sequester, and we can explain that aspect of Lintern's theory just from the perspective that, well, cancer tumors are trying to suck up the extracellular fluids, and they're going to suck up not only the toxins that the funguses produce, but also the funguses themselves. Okay, so let me just end the video there and say those are two more toxins that we covered. Stay tuned for more. There's a lot more exciting developments happening in this theory. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.